Since the Great Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, Washington's most demanding challenge had been to simply hold his army together. He was disappointed that the French seemed more interested in fighting for the wealth of the West Indies than fighting for the freedom of the newly United States. But the French presence had diverted Clinton, whose forces were concentrated in New York. At the end of 1779, Washington moved his army back to the hills above Morristown, New Jersey. He set his men to the task of building a soldier city of log cabins. They lived in tents until the cabin's completion.
The sufferings of the poor soldiers can scarcely be described. While on duty, they are unavoidably exposed to all the inclemency of storms and severe cold. At night, they now have a bed of straw on the ground and a single blanket to each man. They are badly clad, and some are destitute of shoes. Dr. James Thatcher.
In less than 2 months, they had constructed over 1,000 cabins. Now at least they had some relief from the unrelenting snows. But the snows made transport of food and other supplies extremely difficult.
We were absolutely, literally starved. I do solemnly declare that I did not put a single morsel of victuals into my mouth for 4 days and as many nights, except a little black birch bark which I gnawed off a stick of wood, if that can be called victuals. I saw several men roast their old shoes and eat them, and I was afterwards informed by one of the officers' waiters that some of the officers killed and ate a favorite little dog that belonged to one of them. Joseph Plum Martin.
Although Washington sympathized with the misery of his troops and lobbied constantly to alleviate it, he didn't share it.
Washington headquartered in the mansion of a widow named Ford, a beautiful house, but terribly crowded when his whole staff and his servants had to house with him.
Martha came from Mount Vernon to join her husband, as she did every winter of the war.
At Morristown, though he had daily concerns with his army, the social side of Washington emerges. We see him having afternoon riding parties with the ladies and evening dinners and balls and dances.
This has been true of armies since the dawn of time. Of course, the general lives better than the enlisted men. So at Morristown and Valley Forge and other winter camps, Washington lived in a fairly substantial house, very often almost a mansion. The enlisted men accepted as part of the class system of the day, as long as he made sure that their food was decent, they had enough firewood, and he did work day and night at that. He was always struggling with the commissary to get better food for these men and writing to the Continental Congress to try to do something about the abominable system of feeding the army, which they had set up.
Nevertheless, Washington faced the first Continental Army mutiny at the end of that snowy Morristown winter. On the evening of May 25th, several armed regiments paraded about the camp with their arms, refusing to disperse. They were angry about their lack of food and poor conditions, yet unsure about their methods. The mutiny soon lost its explosive quality, but the frustration of the troops remained.
The worm of hunger gnawing so keen kept us from being entirely quiet. We therefore still kept upon the parade in groups, venting our spleen at our country and government, then at our officers, then at ourselves for our imbecility in staying there, and starving for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us. Joseph Plum Martin.
The mutiny ended quietly and without violence. But Washington was deeply affected by the dissatisfaction of his men and harbored pessimistic thoughts about winning the war without greater support from an indifferent citizenry and an ineffectual Congress.
Certain I am that unless Congress speaks in a more decisive tone, unless they are vested with powers by the several states competent to the great purposes of war, or assume them as a matter of right, and they and the states respectively act with more energy than they hitherto have done, that our cause is lost. George Washington after the Morristown Mutiny.
The war had grown long. By the end of the Morristown winter, nearly 5,000 Americans had lost their lives in the 5 years of struggle to combat injuries. But several times as many had died of starvation and disease. And still, no end to the fighting was in sight.